culture needs to be nurtured, and it needs to be nurtured because we've seen that a lot of safety performance is related directly to attitudes, behaviours and values. And yeah, people can't be fixed in the same way that a system can be fixed. So it's very important that you nurture the culture, and you can do that by demonstrating genuine concern for people, genuine concern for the health of the plant and the health of the planet and the environment in which you operate. And that concern needs to be genuine, and it needs to be felt by the people in the workforce. So that really does summarise why we think process safety culture and any safety culture is important to understand in your organisation.
Thanks, Caroline. We're having a few technical issues, which I'm sorting out in the background. That's why my video was off. But there's been a couple of people struggling to join. So, but I know that last time we had some really good questions, and one of them was, so if we have a poor safety culture, is that going to necessarily mean we have a poor process safety culture, or vice versa? If we have a good safety culture, does that necessarily mean we're going to have a good process safety culture?
It's a very interesting question, Louise, and I say that probably you do need a good basic safety culture in order for process safety culture to be healthy, but they are different things, and we measure them separately because probably the default position for most people when you ask people about safety, they just think about personal safety. They tend not to think of the process safety angle. In most organisations, process safety isn't to the forefront of people's minds as kind of personal safety is. So I guess they are similar, but I think it would be true that you could have a positive or even very positive personal safety culture in an organisation, but have very little focus on process and process safety. And that, I think, is what happened with BP in the lead up to the Deepwater Horizon situation, because they were extremely focused and had a very, very good record in terms of personal safety, particularly slips, trips and falls. I mean, potentially to the extent where that was perceived possibly as over the top. And in the post-incident review, that came out as something that was very clear. There was an absolute over-focus on personal safety, and there was a good culture of that to some respects, but there was very little thought being given to process safety in the same way. So I think it is unlikely that if you have a positive process safety culture that you have a bad personal safety culture, but I think it would be perfectly possible to have a good general safety culture where there is very little focus on process safety.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was reading the report again from Texas City. In the 30 years before the incident, they had 23 fatalities, and a majority, well, actually all of those were associated with process safety incidents. But still the management didn't put any focus on that. It makes you wonder whether they were focusing on personal safety because it was a metric everybody else was interested in, or they were focusing on personal safety because they wanted to get everyone home safe. You know, so what is your driver behind your safety focus? I think does that sometimes influence your culture without you knowing if your driver is coming through in your messaging?
Completely, and I think that is probably the one of the key factors, actually. So as we saw, as I mentioned earlier, leadership is often the key driver of any culture, both safety, just general safety culture, and process safety culture. And if you are not messaging the right thing, if people perceive that, you know, production is king, or production comes first, and people don't feel that they can really challenge that in a healthy way, then yeah, that's really makes things difficult for people. So it is very much the case that in most organisations, leaders drive outcomes and make decisions, and you know, people do look to them. I think we last time we met, we talked about you know, some of the differences between a very mature safety culture, particularly process safety culture, and one which is still you know, on the kind of improvement scale. And what we tend to see is in cultures where perhaps people don't feel very empowered, and perhaps there's not a great deal of communication, that those are the cultures where leadership and management are really the strongest drivers, because people are looking to them to make the right decisions and lead the way. Whereas in organisations where the safety culture is very, very positive, perhaps leadership isn't such a strong driver, actually, because everybody feels like they are a leader. Genuinely, they are able to make decisions, they feel empowered, and not just empowered to speak up, but genuinely empowered and motivated to take responsibility, to take ownership, to make decisions for themselves, to work collaboratively and to communicate well. And in those situations, we tend to see that perhaps leadership, as how we measure it in the assessments, is not such a strong driver anymore, because it's just functioning in the background and isn't something that is such a massive lever as we see in other organisations.
And then if you had that sort of good process safety culture, is it very easy to go the other way if you get a poor leader in?
Yeah, and another good question. Our observation has been that change is not as difficult as we sometimes hear. So the media, for example, often talk about culture, organisational cultures. Oh, culture takes a long time to change. It's a slow process. That has not been our observation at all. That's not been what we have tended to see. Culture can change very quickly, both positively and negatively, and we have seen the results of that quite often, where perhaps to do with a big shake-up in the organisation, a lot of change at the top of the house, or change actually in the middle management and the field supervisors. So things can change actually really quickly. They probably shouldn't do. I mean, I guess I've heard people say, a culture should live within the organisation, should live within the people who work there, and that is absolutely true. But again, I guess if you've got a very strong safety culture where everybody generally takes ownership, that is harder for one individual leader or a group of leaders to really have an impact on. But I guess most organisations aren't in a position yet where they are really living and breathing the safety culture that they want to, and therefore, a leadership change can have a huge difference, both in terms of positively, in terms of really changing things for the better, but also having a detrimental effect where potentially they could just absolutely shut down conversation, stop people from challenging, people feel intimidated, or they just don't feel that they can go against the flow. So it is, I would say, cultures are very sensitive, but because they're sensitive, they can change really quickly for the good and the bad.
So we should feel encouraged if we get a result which is not good, that we're not stuck there.
Absolutely, and also on top of that, I would say, even if you get a result that's mediocre, I mean, we've used the surveys in a lot of places where the safety culture appears kind of stagnant and safety performance appears stagnant. So it's kind of plateaued. So the safety culture may be kind of okay, but it's really plateaued, and the leadership don't know how to take them to the next level in their safety performance or safety culture. So it's not always about problem finding or giving leadership teams a kick up the backside and say, look, you really need to address this. It's sometimes really useful when things seem safe, they're ticking along, but that can be the danger zone, right? That can be the danger zone where complacency kicks in, people feel really comfortable, they may start to normalise some risks without really thinking about that on a day-to-day basis, and that's where an assessment of your safety culture can really help you uncover where you need to go to next.
Okay, well, we've had a question from Jason. What are your thoughts about the concept of less safety where you are, the safer you feel? And hence, with the chronic unease, mature safety culture, believe that they are less safe rather than the others who feel like they're more safe because they don't really know. Yeah,
absolutely. And I guess that's what I was just mentioned there. There's quite a lot of that. We do see because safety cultures are sensitive, the tools we use to assess safety culture is also very sensitive. So there are questions that we ask which on the one hand may suggest that people are fully aware. They say they're fully aware. Yeah, we there is questions about chronic unease. We are alert to the early signs of safety issues. We act on them. We welcome bad news. And then there may be questions that ask about how comfortable people feel on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes there's a conflict between what people say. Oh, we're super good at this. We're really aware. We think about what could go wrong every day. And actually then, lots of people say, I'm completely comfortable here. I have absolutely no concerns whatsoever for the safety of the site or my own personal safety. So there's a real conflict, and it helps us to understand, what's driving that conflict. And that's quite often about the routine work. People are very conscious and will do all the risk assessments for work that is known to be high risk. But those routine tasks, day in, day out, how often are people stopping, looking at what's going on, discussing the risks? Do they discuss those risks every time, regardless of how regular or routine that work is? And that's a great question from Jason, because it is about that. We do see that there can be great deal of complacency actually, and comfort, and people are pleased with that comfort when they see the results. They're like, yeah, we're really safe, people feel really safe, and we're like, no, actually something's not right here. Why do people feel that comfortable when they're working in an extremely high risk workplace? So yeah, that's often a good conversation to have when the results appear very positive. It doesn't always necessarily mean that the safety culture is healthy. It can sometimes mean that people are just become a bit too comfortable.
So there's sort of a niche point between not knowing enough about what the hazards are, and then actually having seen the hazards all the time. You might know everything about it, but you've seen it so much. So there's a point in between where you want to try and keep people alert and active.
Yeah.
I have a follow-on statement from Jason, and then hence the effort on process safety culture maturity. Can this skew the results? So I think you've answered that. Yes, definitely, that this sort of mindset can skew the results. But actually, your survey has been able to pick that up when that has happened. So even though it's skewing the results, you're able to pick up these issues. Yeah. We haven't had any more questions come in. I know, Caroline, that you said that leadership is one of the big levers, especially for a less mature organization. You mentioned that you have like a cheaper sort of survey, which just does sort of a pulse check on your leadership, like a 360 review for leaders. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, how it works, what we might learn from it, and then how we might be able to use those results in our organization?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. Yes, so I suppose a little bit of background. So we have several tools that we use to assess safety culture and process safety culture. Two of them are very, very in-depth, large-scale surveys, which probably do take 20 to 25 minutes for people to really answer properly. There's lots of open-ended questions. People can give their feedback. It's not just a tick box exercise. And we know that that's quite a large undertaking for an organisation to roll that survey out, and the results that it produces are extremely detailed. A couple of years ago, probably about 3 years ago now, actually, we were asked to produce a much smaller survey that actually doesn't measure safety culture, but does measure process safety leadership. However, what we mean by leadership isn't just pointing the finger directly at senior management or middle management. This survey, which is only about 5 or 6 minutes, helps us to measure all different angles of process safety leadership. So indeed, yes, the senior management, what they do, the decisions they make, what decisions supervisors and that level make, and then also just us as individuals. How are people responding to process safety? Do they feel they have ownership? Do they act like they are owners? Do they feel like they're a critical human barrier, in preventing process safety incidents? And that really does give us a very in-depth look at just one dimension of safety culture, which is process safety leadership. And we picked on that predominantly because it is often such a driver of process safety culture. And so it's very in-depth. It in one dimension only. It is completely one-dimensional, but it can really help to understand where those gaps are, both in terms of what, again, the disconnects between senior leaders, frontline leaders, and the workforce, in terms of how each of them perceive the leadership dimension. So it can be very, very useful, but you do have to accept that that's only looking at the one dimension around process safety leadership, but it is a very important dimension, and it is often the most important dimension, actually.
Okay, and you mentioned before that there are often some areas of strength which you see in a lot of organizations. So are these linked, you said before, that are these the sort of systematic things which we as engineers feel much more comfortable with? Are these the sort of things that we are much stronger at delivering?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, yeah. So quite often people perceive, for the most part, that a lot of processes are done well. So yeah, the practices and controls, yeah, people will say, the vast majority of people will say, yeah, we are operating within the design limits of our equipment, the operating envelopes are good, yeah, the controls are in place. Alarm management can be not always great. On the whole, procedures, people probably think they're okay. In some organizations they're not, and that can be a weakness. Most of the time people probably think that the risk management methods and tools are pretty good. Probably most of the time in organizations where management of change is kind of operationalized, that people probably perceive that that's done quite well. So those kind of system processy things, tend to be seen as done quite well for the most part. What is often done less well, though, in terms of system, is maintenance. Maintenance is in the process safety culture survey. We have a big focus on maintenance and the maintenance regime that's in place, and how well that's supported by leadership and how well it's resourced. And quite often that's something that does not perform quite so well. And I've often thought that people think that maintenance isn't always done well because they can see it, right? They can see the rust, they can see small leaks, they can see these things. So that's kind of easy to identify. It's not so easy to see a rusty leader. No. That's something that's subconscious, on the subconscious level. So it is often those things that are very processy that probably perform the best, although they are often also quite strong drivers, and people perceive them to be important. So people perceive that processes are an important part of safety culture. Whereas they might not see, for example, sharing information, sharing process safety reports and performance. That they don't see that as important, but it's often not done well and is a strong driver of the overall safety culture. So there is very interesting dynamics within the assessment.
It's part of, I think, what we've always been told is important, that the process is important, to have it defined. That's what we've told was important. But actually, when you think about it, knowing how we're performing, like with this COVID thing, knowing how many hospitalizations there are, how many people are testing positive in your area, that's actually really important information for us. Whereas people might think that the most important thing would be that the track and trace is in place. And even though that is important, knowing your personal risk, the information associated with your location is actually really important for your driver, isn't it?
Yeah. And just adding to that, I mean, one of the areas that is very variable across organizations is the amount of awareness, amount of process safety awareness, knowledge and expertise that is within an organization. And one of the ways to improve awareness, not just through training and coaching and closer supervision, but is by sharing that process safety information and explaining it. This is what we mean. This is why we're measuring this. This is what performance, this is what we mean by process safety performance. This is what process safety effectively is. And to see that kind of lived out, and have that communicated to you. So things like that are often, again, subconsciously quite important, but people wouldn't necessarily articulate that that's what is important to them in a process safety culture. The things they articulate as being seen to be most important: processes, maintenance, and communication is understood to be important. But nearly always the top two most important elements that people say are important in a process safety culture are processes and maintenance, because they're easy to see. Probably they're very top of mind, and we would probably describe these as the hygiene factors. So because they're so top of mind for people, because people say they're very important, if you're underperforming in those areas, that's probably quite serious for people, because they rely on those things to be done well. They don't have to be done fantastically well, but they need to be good enough in people's minds that they're no longer kind of tweaking away, oh, maintenance is bad, processes are bad, because they just become a bit of a negative kind of talking point. I think particularly with maintenance, that's something that people will talk about a lot and can drag people down.
Yeah, it can. And also with the budget cuts, that's often one of the first places it goes. Yeah. I've got a question here from Abilisha. I may have pronounced your name wrong, sorry. What is the optimum number of safety culture sessions an organization must have in their schedule? So firstly, what would you define as a safety culture session? And then what would be something we could put in our schedule to say?
Yeah, in terms of kind of talking about it, I guess if that's what we mean by sessions, I mean, yeah, probably we would say it's something that should be talked about all the time, and at every opportunity where there's a gathering. So, into toolbox talk, so it's very much a kind of day-to-day reality, in kind of learning from incidents, reviews that people get together and have. So I think these things can really help. And in terms of sessions, I mean, when we've worked with organisations, they've put together an action plan afterwards. I guess scheduled in usually is at least a monthly session about safety and process safety and safety culture, where you very much hand over to people in the front line and ask them to come and talk about what's going on at their site. Give an example of where they spoke up, or where they challenged a supervisor, or something like this, so that it's not just something that's coming from leadership down the line, although that, of course, that is very important, but there needs to be a great deal of participation. So it's probably not so much about the number of sessions, but potentially about the quality of those sessions and who is engaged, because engagement is an absolute kind of critical element of safety culture. If people don't feel they're engaged, they probably also don't feel that they have a stake in the culture, and that will lead to them not feeling they have any ownership and not being the human barrier that they truly are. And I think that's that's a great loss if the people who actually are your greatest defence against safety and process safety incidents don't feel that they're 100% engaged. Then I think that's a real missed opportunity. So in terms of frequency, yeah, I think you probably should be doing that on a regular basis, if it's possible to do weekly, but certainly monthly. Really look at the quality of that, and who's engaged with that and who can participate, and real encouragement to do that with people at the front line.
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen in organizations is like a meeting overload. So with safety culture and process safety culture, rather than having a new meeting where you start talking about it once a month or once a week, just try and integrate it into your existing meetings. So, and also, as Caroline said, getting different people to talk about it is really key. I know in organizations where I've been, they expect me to talk about process safety, right? Because I am the safety and loss prevention engineer or the technical safety engineer. They expect me to talk about it. But I feel really good in an organization. I feel good about the culture when other people it's not their discipline, they start talking about process safety. They start talking about procedures. They're worried the maintenance isn't working. That's when I start to feel yeah, we're moving somewhere in the right direction. If it's always me talking, that's when you start to get a bit concerned that other people are not really engaged in this safety culture discussion. But yeah, trying to really have a look at your meetings. I mean, if you have a daily connect with site, maybe having just 5 minutes in that meeting just to ask them if they have had any new operational risk assessments raised over the last 24 hours. Have they seen any issues associated with integrity that have come up? You know, just those sort of open questions gives them a few minutes where they can air something about process safety and start to feel more engaged, like it's their responsibility. But integrating into existing meetings is a great way of doing this. But, you know, I think if you're thinking about having a schedule, try and make sure you integrate it into meetings, but make sure that it's spread out over the month. So don't just do one meeting or think you might do every meeting, because that would be overload. So yeah, just trying to think about how you could spread it out a bit. We haven't had another question come in. So Caroline, are there any areas where, even if we didn't have a survey, where you think that, hey, actually I could just start improving now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, on the soft side, which is where we probably should be focusing. I mean, I think for leadership, people in leadership roles, either senior management or even right down to frontline leadership and supervisors, is to really try and think and consider what you're telling people, you know, and not just what you're telling people, but your body language as well. As I mentioned, safety culture is very sensitive, and people respond accordingly to that sensitivity. So I think what we often see, and this is what, you know, across all organisations we've worked with, is unintentionally, you know, leaders can overly focus on production and getting the job done. And even though I'm sure in their heart, you know, they want everyone to go home safe and nobody wants an incident on their watch, you know, it is surprising how people will hear get the job done, focus on production, the bottom line, you know, we're under pressure, wherever that pressure is coming from, and for that to be very easily communicated to people. And the message they will hear is, just get the job done. I don't care how you do it. It just needs to be done. And we'll, you know, not think about the safety implications of that. And I think with body language, you know, body language is loud. You might not realize, and people often don't realize just how loud that can be. You know, it's a good example. Just be careful about how you come across. If your words don't match your facial expression or your non-verbal communications, that can actually be you know, have a great impact on people, and your message can be easily misinterpreted. And you know, even a very simple example is, you know, if somebody comes to you with a concern, either safety or process safety concern, and you roll your eyes, you know, because you've had a tough day, you know, you've got lots of things to deal with, it's like, no, not another problem. But that could be enough for that person to think, actually I regret opening my mouth now. And maybe depending on the response that, you know, you give them verbally, they might think twice about bringing that bad news to your door next time. And it is really those things. And I know they seem insignificant, and those things are quite difficult to control in ourselves. But I think that's the kind of tip that I think can really help. And of course, you know, some people are doing that really well, and that's not a problem. But it can be those kind of things that really make a difference, I think. So I think in terms of how your kind of your own style, how you communicate with people, the messages that you give, both verbally and non-verbally, and how well they match up, and explaining decisions that you make. So if you make a decision which for some people may appear to be risky in their view, I think if you can explain what that decision is based on, why you're making that decision, what you've considered in terms of the risks, and why you're still going ahead with this decision. I think that really helps people's knowledge and understanding, but also, helps them understand a bit more, and they don't go away and tell their workmate, oh, they're not interested in the concerns that we have, and they've decided to do this and not know the reason for that.
Yeah. I have a question here from Jason. How is it best to improve process safety culture? Training, behavioral training, champions, and how to measure success and how to measure the improvements. And then I've got a follow on. It's saying that culture must be difficult to measure. So I'll put the first one back up.
Yeah, so I guess it will depend on where your process safety culture is at. If you're an organisation that hasn't had a very long-term focus on process safety specifically, if that's something that the workforce in your organisation don't have a great deal of confidence around, so then they would feel that their knowledge is not very good. So they might have a fair idea of what process safety is, but they wouldn't be confident enough to say, yeah, I know, I've got a good idea, or I've got such a good idea, I could actually explain this to somebody else. So if that's where you are in your organisation, where you may have some real experts in your organisation, but perhaps the bulk of your production or operating teams don't have a very good very good understanding, then clearly there is room for training, awareness campaigns, things like that, so that people all you get a basic grounding in process safety, and that will also need to include any contractor or third party people who are working alongside you, sort of in the mid to long term, kind of like service engineers or maintenance crews, etc. So I guess it really depends. If you're then in a position where you think that the people in your organisation have a really good basic understanding of process safety, actually, the kind of like the training there will be much more advanced. It will be much more about them seeing themselves as a critical barrier, and what those, developing that barrier mentality and barrier thinking, so that they are really working well around that. For leaders, for leadership team, I think that there is that's an absolutely excellent question there about behaviour training. I think absolutely, because I think most organisations that we're dealing with, people are from an engineering background. They're not from a social psychology background. They're not experts in organisational culture and matters that are sociological and psychological. And I think there is absolute scope for kind of frontline leadership training, which focuses on both the technical side of leadership, but also on the human factors as well, and how what it means to be a good frontline leader or a good senior leader for that. So I think there is some difference in terms of champions. Yeah, absolutely. I think that is something that we've suggested to people before, and not just champions, but mentors for people as well. So one of the important things that we see that needs to be done is, and isn't done very well in many organisations, is proper coaching of people, on the job kind of training, and to have a mentor or a buddy where you can pal up people who are not so experienced with someone who knows what they're talking about, or likewise a direct employee with a contractor who works alongside, so that knowledge does get shared. And in terms of measuring success, well, I guess internally, how you would measure that, I suppose you would just need your own metrics. But what is interesting is what we tend to see is in organisations where people have low process safety knowledge, or they feel they have low process safety knowledge, quite often all the other measures in the survey overperform or perform above the kind of benchmark that we have. They will perceive that processes are in really good condition. They will think that leadership is great. They will think that communication is good, because actually they just don't know. They don't know. They don't know what they don't know. So they just assume that it's okay. It's okay. Unless I have evidence that it's not okay, I'm going to evaluate this as being done well. It's fine. What we sometimes see is where there has been maybe a year or 18 months of good training for frontline staff, when we go back and repeat the surveys there, you'll sometimes see that, yeah, awareness has gone up, but the scores for other aspects has actually now come down, because people do actually understand what good risk assessment looks like. They do understand what good leadership looks like. They do understand what what should be happening with MOC, and it's not. So we do sometimes we sometimes see that those people perhaps who have or if we look in the same organisation across groups, if we see that there is a group of people who feel they're less knowledgeable versus a group of people who feel that they are more knowledgeable, it's quite often the people who have less knowledge that will score each element higher, because they perhaps just don't have enough scrutiny. They don't have the ability to scrutinize the processes and systems and behaviors, as well as somebody who really does understand what good process safety performance and good process safety culture looks like.
Yeah, I would say that's correct, Caroline. I know a lot of I've been in quite a few organizations where it's been perceived that the management of change was working really, really well. And actually, when I started to ask, are the documents closed at the end of management of change? Are there any changes in the organization which didn't go through MOC? We found that, yes, there's loads of documents which haven't been updated, and yes, there's loads of changes, but everybody thought it was working great because we have an MOC process, we have MOC meetings, but that doesn't mean it's working. Yeah, it's just asking the right questions. But if you don't understand it, there's an MOC meeting, yes. People are visible, yes. Well, then it must be working. It's fine. So yeah, just getting some of that competence up. I'm running a series of introductory trainings, which can really help get your competence up in these different areas. So you can start asking those challenging questions in your organization to see whether, hey, is my HAZOP actually working? Or is my management of change working? Do my risk assessments, as Caroline said, do my risk assessments look good? Because having a piece of paper and the content of it is not great, that's not actually going to help your safety performance. Another thing, Caroline, that I've seen is that some of the leaders I've worked with are really passionate about process safety. But when I talk to other people about that leader, they have no idea that person is passionate about process safety. Mm-hmm. They think they're only interested in production. But actually, when I talk to them one-on-one, the passion comes out so much, and I know that they would not make any decision without having considered process safety. Is that something that you see, and how can you sort of fix that in yourself if that's something that comes out in you?
Yeah, we see that a lot, actually, Louise, and we see it actually when we debrief on the results to the leadership teams, who are often really uncomfortable with the results that they see from the surveys, especially the questions that are asked directly of process safety leadership and management. And there's often a denial around that. Oh, I don't recognize this. Who has said this? This isn't how. This is nothing like who we are. And sometimes we do see those big disconnects between how the leadership team have rated things like leadership or communication, and how the frontline have rated these things. And you think, how is that? Why is that gap there? And that is just about visibility, I think, and how close those leaders are to the front line. And that can be tough. That can be really tough when a leadership team, like you say, some members, very passionate about this, and they've communicated that in their survey results because they think they're doing a good job, and then people come and say they're confused about whether production or process safety is the priority. They don't feel that the focus on process safety culture is genuine. It feels like a tick box exercise, and you think, wow, how is this big disconnect happening? And I think that is largely down to visibility and communication and talking about it. If you are a leadership team and in your own leadership team meetings you talk about process safety all the time and you make decisions, and you fail to communicate those, you may have responded really well to a concern that somebody raised. You may have put good things in place to deal with that concern. You may have addressed it. You may have closed out the action on that, and you never told anybody about it. For the person who brought that concern to them, that just says you didn't do anything about it at all. If I raise a problem And even if you say, oh yeah, thank you very much, that was yes, we're going to deal with this, and then it just goes into the abyss, goes into the black hole with all the other problems, and you never hear about it anymore. And I think that is absolutely critical, and it's what we advise leadership teams, all the time, that listen to what people are saying. This is a perception, and that perception is coming from somewhere. For some reason, they think that you are not giving the focus to process safety that you say that you are. So you say it, but they don't see the actions. And that's probably because you have not communicated the actions. You just probably didn't think it was important to get back to people or to tell them. And that's just perception, right? That's just about, and culture is almost all perception rather than anything tangible, which goes back to culture must be difficult to measure. Yeah, reality is difficult to measure, but perceptions are actually very easy to measure. And it's then joining up reality and perceptions and making sure that they reflect each other. And I know that sounds a bit airy-fairy, but that's how it happens. So I think that's what we tend to see. Leadership teams can be really very good, and it can be very shocking to hear people say things like, oh, management here, and sometimes it's very specific about which management. The production, the manager of the production unit X, it's always they're not interested in process safety. They don't talk about it, and then they think, how did this happen? And it's just because of communication.
Yeah. I mean, I know that earlier in my career, I was given a task of reviewing the fire water ring main because it had been a system which was not neglected, but some things it was perceived to be over-designed. And so therefore some maintenance was pushed out because there was this perception that the system was so over-designed, we didn't have to maintain everything. But when I looked at it, actually 50% of the backup system for the fire water was not operational because there was this perception that it was so over-designed. They'd actually taken it all the way to, it's not even to meet the minimum standards required for that company that I was working for. So, but at that time, I had that information. I thought, I've got to go and tell them they've got to shut down. And I was very nervous. But when I went to speak to the asset manager about it, he was like, he did say, oh, well, this is difficult news. He said, but, do you believe that we could continue to operate? I said, not for very long. And I said, and even if you do, we need to put in additional risk measures. We need to shut down as soon as possible. And he said, well, it's pointless shutting down now because we don't have the parts. He said, so we'll operate for 2 weeks. Tell me what measures we need to put in place. And we had to shut down. But even though I could see that it was uncomfortable news that we had to shut down the platform, he responded very well to it. And he communicated the reason why we were having the shutdown was to repair the firewater system. And, so other people understood the reason why he was taking this decision. And, it was a difficult decision to take. But then I worked on another organization where we had a big problem with like flashpoint of seal oil, and we didn't know why we had the problem and how to fix it. And the leader, when we spoke to him, he was much less receptive to the news. Everything we had to put in place, we had to demonstrate to him first while we needed to. So, it does impact how you feel about communicating that news. And I think that's why I felt nervous about communicating the news, because I'd worked in the other one first and then this one. So it's refreshing when the leader is like, okay, yes, this is difficult, but let's work out together what we can do. I've got another question from Jason. Yeah. Is there an increasing trend of accountability upon organizations for their cultural maturity from regulators in the HSE?
To be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I think there has been a kind of just a trend in general to understand your safety culture, but I haven't seen any evidence that there's a relationship between having a certain advanced culture and what for example in the UK the HSE exec would want. And I know that certainly in the organisations I've worked with, the focus on the safety culture assessment and improvement has always been very clearly voluntary, so that it isn't directly linked to any other kind of performance metric, because then it just becomes another tick box exercise, and people will answer according to how they think the organisation wants a certain result, and would actually potentially destroy the genuineness of the assessment. So whether there is any actual link, we've certainly in the 65 plus facilities we've worked on, we've not seen that. There have been perhaps talks in the past about trying to relate that, whether having a good process safety culture is good for your insurance policy or things like that, your liability and those kind of things. I've not seen any of that, and I think it would be not great for genuine safety culture progression for there to be any link between those things, because it will just become a tick box exercise. We need to get this green light in order for X, Y, and Z. That's my view. I don't know if you're aware of anything else, Louise.
Yeah, no. So although there's no direct link between, say, like a culture measurement and the regulators, I know that regulators pay more attention to organizations which they perceive to have poor safety culture. So, I mean, for example, even just in the UK, if a site is having a lot of incidents, the HSE are going to be a lot more interested in that organization. They're going to do a lot more inspections. They're going to come around more regularly. They're going to want to look at more documents. And that's not because they've measured a survey or anything. They know that that organization is not performing well in an area, and they are putting more pressure on them to try and drive improved performance. The same I've seen also in Norway, when the regulator perceives that a certain organization has really good process safety management, they have a much less focus on that organization. But for example, there were some new operators in Norway when I was there. Those new operators get a lot more intervention from the regulator, especially during the first year to 18 months of their operatorship. It's to try and build that good, strong foundation for safety culture. Even though it's setting up the processes, etc., all of that is really good, but it's all about the culture and how they perceive. With regards to the insurance, I know that even though the insurance are looking specifically at, your MOC process, etc., when they come for a visit, they are actually, in a way, measuring your safety culture, and it does impact your insurance premium. But it's not because they've measured it. They can tell, this place is a complete mess. Nobody knows whether they're coming or going. What's an isolation permit? Oh, I don't know what that is. Yeah, there's a problem here, and if we're going to insure this place, it's tricky. Yeah, if they go and ask questions, yes, no, this is this isolation permit. This is how we lock valves open. This is who's checked it. This is who audits it. This is how often we've audited it. These are the results. This is how we're improving. Yeah, okay, I feel quite good that this place knows what they're doing associated with this item. They have a good culture associated with that. So even though it's not directly measured, I know it does impact their actual activity associated with different organizations, and it has impacted insurance premiums associated with. But it's not, it's like you say, I wouldn't say that you need to do the survey and you need to get a certain score and then you'll get a reduced anything. But that's not the right way. But having a good process safety culture is good for business, because you're not going to have incidents, you're not going to have interruption to production, and therefore if it's good for business, it's good for your insurance, because insurance is about interruption to business. So they're kind of linked together. I don't know, Caroline, is that?
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds right to me, and I think you're right. I guess it's more about safety performance, but we know that there is a strong link between safety performance and safety culture. And I think nearly all the incident reviews of the big incidents that we've looked at, similar to what you were talking about earlier, Louise, Texas City, Bhopal, the Space Challenge, NASA's Space Shuttle Challenger, all those things. There was a strong relationship between the safety performance and the safety culture, or the general organizational culture as well, not just the safety culture, but the organizational culture.
Yeah, and there has been some concerns I've seen recently surface on LinkedIn about the culture within India, because there has been a large number of high consequence incidents, probably since about April this year. And it's almost, they were happening daily in India. And I saw some people voicing a concern that there was some sort of cultural element to this, of how the regulator interacts with the different organizations, etc. Well, thank you very much, everyone who attended. Thanks, Caroline, again for your time. Really appreciate it, and for the really great answers. Next week, we're going to be having another guest, and it is Jill. Jill's going to be giving us some information about environmental critical elements and how they impact with process safety, whether looking at environmental critical elements means that you're having to do something completely different. So Jill Butler will be joining us next week at 8 p.m. So really looking forward to that session, just a different perspective on process safety and how you bring these sort of environmental consequences into your assessment and making them in sort of as much of a streamlined way as you possibly can without doing extra work, but still considering the environment and making sure you can perform in your asset. So thanks, Caroline. Thank you, everyone on the line. I'm going to launch the feedback, and then I'll end the call in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening and for great questions as well.